I'm having a discussion about the goings, the going-ons that became the Continental Congress, that became the reasons for writing the Declaration of Independence. If you'd like to enter into the conversation, 622-9622 is the number to call. Once again, that's 352-622-9622 is the number to call if you'd like to be part of the discussion. We talked about the Boston Massacre and what that had done. Now, after the Boston Massacre, there was outrage, but it still was not outrage felt from top of the colonies to the bottom of the colonies. It was a lot of outrage in Massachusetts. The people of New York didn't like, people of Pennsylvania didn't like it, but there wasn't the outrage that was in Boston. Now, 3 years later, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773. Well, that didn't set well with Bostonians or Americans, but they were Englishmen at the time because they loved their tea. And now you're going to have to pay tax on all the tea. Well, as we know, a bunch of colonists dressed as Native Americans boarded the East India Company ship in Boston Harbor, dumped its entire cargo into the sea. We now know it as the Boston Tea Party. Now, in response to that, the British, instead of saying, hey, what's the problem? Let's talk, they said, we're going to crack the whip. And they passed the coercive acts. They even revoked the colonial charter of Massachusetts. They closed the port of Boston. We knew them as the intolerable acts in the colonies. They were called the coercive acts in Parliament. But that led to the First Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia in 1774, and they denounced taxation without representation. That's where that cry comes from. But they stopped short of demanding independence. It's very important that the First Continental Congress, when they met, denounced the no taxation without representation, but didn't want independence. It was thought that there was a massive push for independence. There was not a massive push for independence. Matter of fact, it is estimated or theorized by historians that half, if not more, of the colonists didn't want independence from England. They were Englishmen. So the question was, would the colonists reconcile or separate? Now, we all know about the shot heard around the world was the start of the Revolution, battle at Concord and Lexington. But before we get there, let's talk about Thomas Paine. He was an Englishman who put out the pamphlet Common Sense. He was an English immigrant, and he helped push the path toward independence. And back in those times, pamphlets were very, very popular as a way to push the agenda. Kind of like, those voting, those mail-out things, not ballots, the mail-out advertisement we get in our mailbox every year, that there's an election touting who's good and who's not good and everything. Well, pamphlets were smaller, but they got to the point, and they were able to be distributed, stamped, nailed up on doors of restaurants and everything, so everybody would have access to read them. Well, Thomas Paine had a unique idea, because most colonists at the time of January of 1776, that's when Common Sense was published, most colonists considered themselves to be Britons, but just unrepresented Britons. They were aggrieved. And Thomas Paine said, nope, that's not accurate. And he was right. Thomas Paine said, Europe, not England, is the parent country of America. It's been an asylum for persecuted lovers of civil and religious liberty from every part of Europe, not just England. Hither they have fled, not from the tender embraces of the mother, but from the cruelty of the monster. And it is so far true of England that the same tyranny which drove the first immigrants from home pursues their descendants still. Thomas Paine put the blame squarely on the English for perpetrating this, that we're all English, when in actuality, it was a mass immigration from many places in Europe. There were German settlers. There were Dutch settlers. there were British settlers, but Scottish settlers. There was a lot of different people from all over Europe. The Spanish had come. The French had come. America was not an English colony. It was a European colony that was, for the most part, tyrannically oversaw by the English. That's what Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense. And by the way, when you think about it, that's a very good name for that pamphlet, because Common Sense says he's right. Well, it was taken and spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, because a lot of people hadn't thought of it that way. They just thought they were Britons who weren't getting a fair shake in Parliament. They thought that the bad, misbehaved Massachusetts colony was getting kind of what it deserved for everything it was doing. You know, throwing tea in the harbor, you ruined business practices. You were surrounding in angry mobs the English regulars, even though they had been quartered through the coercive acts, the intolerable acts. You had to put the army up, the English regulars up in your houses. But people were like, that's just part of it. We're from Europe. We're from Britain. We don't want to break away from that. That's our security blanket. They still support us. We just want more representation in Congress. Then Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. And that fundamentally changed the tenor of the argument for the colonies to become independent. I cannot express to you how important the pamphlet Common Sense was in helping turn some people into the way of revolution and independence. Matter of fact, Pauline Maier, the late Pauline Maier, who was professor of history at MIT, said in a 2013 lecture on the making of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine's argument, well, we had to break from Britain because the system of British constitutionally was hopelessly flawed. Britain had hereditary rule. It had a king. You could never have freedom so long as you have hereditary rule. As long as one family's in charge making the rules, you can never have freedom. That's what Thomas Paine said. But not everybody still wanted peace. Not everybody wanted to break away. The Continental Congress was meeting in June and July of 1776. And Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, he came up with a resolution. Because there were people talking about independence, but he came up with a resolution for independence. John Adams seconded the motion. Yeah, that John Adams, who not only was he second president of the United States, he was also the lawyer who successfully defended the British regulars and got them off of murder charges in the Boston Massacre. Now, Lee's resolution declared that the colonies are free and independent. They should be absolved from all allegiance to the crown, and all political recollection between them and the state of Great Britain ought to be totally dissolved. It should be immediately taken for procuring the assistance of foreign powers, and a confederation formed to bind the colonies more closely together. That was what Lee, he introduced this. Virginia introduced the Independence Clause. Now, during the ensuing debates, look, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, South Carolina, and I believe, I think Maryland, I'd have to check that, but I think Maryland as well, were unwilling to declare independence. They didn't want to break away from England. And why not? New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, they all were tied to commerce. Their number one place that they shipped their goods and got goods back in was England. They didn't want to upset the apple cart. Massachusetts wanted to upset the apple cart. Those colonies at the time, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, South Carolina, I'm almost sure Maryland was part of it too, didn't want to upset the apple cart. So they wanted to have more debate and everything. So Congress agreed to delay the vote on independence till July 1. But while the debate raged on, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia were all drafted to start writing the letter of independence that would be presented to King George if and when it became part of what this Congress wanted to do. Now, remember, a war is going on at this time. Remember, while they're thinking about this, there's already a war going on. Some 20,000 troops under George Washington were already fighting. They'd already taken the British garrison in Boston because the British evacuated in March of that year. He then moved the Continental Army to New York. There was fighting going on between the British regulars and the Continental Army. Yes, some in Congress still clung to the assumption of reconciliation. Now, King George, he wasn't about reconciliation. We're crushing their rebellion. He went in front of Parliament. He told them we're crushing the rebellion. We're not going to have these upstart colonists dictate what we do. And King George's position was clear, although the colonists didn't know that at the time. There were still, like I said, some colonists that wanted reconciliation. But remember, colonists were dying already, as were the British. Hundreds of American lives have been lost at the Lexington, Concord, and the Battle of Bunker Hill. 1,000 British had been killed. 1,000 regulars had been killed on their side. So this was, we were at war, although there was a group of colonies that wanted reconciliation. How did that change their mind? Well, we'll talk about that next. You're listening to Ocala Talks on 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, WOCA, The Source.
Everybody's looking for BOGOs these days, and Bob Wine's Camellia Gardens in Ocala